Stop for a moment, because what you are about to understand may explain something you have been quietly carrying without fully naming it. There are nights when silence does not feel like rest. There are moments when the mind refuses to settle, not because the world is loud, but because something deep inside has finally become louder than all the noise. And somewhere out there, a person who once had your presence, your patience, your emotional depth, and your genuine understanding is sitting alone with a realization they can no longer outrun. A realization that did not arrive gently. One that arrived the way all important truths eventually do, through the undeniable weight of loss. They had something real, and they treated it as though it would never disappear. But now the absence of what they once ignored has become the most powerful force in their inner world. And deep within the psychological structure of who they are, something has quietly begun to shift, because the human soul carries a dangerous habit. It does not recognize what truly matters until a moment lost forces that recognition into consciousness. People are capable of deceiving others. They are capable of deceiving themselves. They can bury emotional truth beneath pride, beneath distractions, beneath the temporary comfort of things that do not last. But the unconscious mind forgets nothing that carried genuine emotional meaning. Every real connection, every careless wound, every moment that deserved more presence and more care, all remain stored within the deeper layers of the psyche. And when a person finally can no longer avoid the understanding that they destroyed something irreplaceable, the mind begins turning against its own illusions from the inside out. Sleep becomes different. Thoughts become heavier. Even the silence around them begins carrying a different emotional quality. Because beneath everything they show the world, they already know. They have already begun to understand. Welcome to Jung and Awareness Hub, where silence reveals truth and distance exposes what words never could. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forms of emotional confession. Most people assume that regret always arrives through words, through explanations, apologies, or direct admissions of wrongdoing. But the deepest forms of human realization rarely surface that way. The psyche does not always communicate its truths through language. It communicates through behavior, through emotional restlessness, through the subtle but unmistakable way a person's inner world begins changing long before they are ready to speak openly about why the person who understands, even unconsciously, that they made a serious mistake rarely announces immediately. The ego resists that kind of vulnerability. Pride steps in early to protect the individual from the discomfort of shame. And so at first, the change appears invisible. But it is not invisible. It is simply internal. It is happening beneath the surface, inside the psychological architecture of the person who caused the damage, whether they are fully aware of it or not. This is because the human psyche is not designed to remain at peace after causing harm to something that carried genuine emotional meaning. The conscious mind may attempt to justify the past, to construct narratives that protect self-image, to minimize what happened or explain it away. But the deeper layers of the personality continue holding the emotional truth. They do not negotiate with the ego's defenses. They simply keep carrying the weight, quietly and persistently, until that weight becomes impossible to ignore. At first, the silence of someone processing regret can appear cold. It can look like indifference. It can look like emotional distance or deliberate avoidance. But there comes a point when that silence transforms into something entirely different. It becomes heavy, the kind of heavy that does not come from not caring, but from caring far more than the person ever allowed themselves to admit. They begin thinking in ways they did not before. Conversations that ended without resolution begin replaying inside them. Small details they once overlooked start gaining emotional significance. The absence of the person they lost begins creating a specific kind of psychological pressure, one that does not ease with time the way they expected it to, because meaningful emotional connections do not dissolve simply because someone walks away from them. The unconscious mind continues holding emotional truth long after the ego has decided it is finished with the situation. There's a reason why silence grows louder after real loss, when a person who genuinely mattered is no longer emotionally present. The distractions that once filled the space begin losing their power. The mind can no longer avoid confronting what is actually missing. And absence, in its psychological form, is not emptiness. It is a force. It moves through the inner world with a kind of quiet intensity that disrupts everything the ego thought it had under control. What was once taken completely for granted suddenly becomes emotionally significant. Memories that seemed ordinary at the time begin returning with unexpected intensity. Small moments, brief conversations, a familiar tone, a specific kind of emotional understanding. These things begin surfacing repeatedly within the unconscious mind. This happens not as punishment, but as psychological processing. The mind is attempting to complete what was left unresolved. Unfinished emotional experiences do not disappear from the psyche. They continue existing as internal tension, seeking resolution, surfacing in thoughts and feelings and behaviors that the person themselves may not fully understand. This is why someone who wants to dismiss your presence can begin feeling surrounded by reminders of you without any external cause. Not because the universe is forcing a lesson upon them, but because the unconscious mind connects emotional meaning to memory. And when that emotional meaning was real, it does not stay buried. It returns. It persists. It shapes the inner experience of the person who chose not to see your value when they had the opportunity to. This is also why transformation often begins long before a person speaks. Their behavior begins shifting in ways they cannot entirely explain or control. They may hesitate where they once acted with certainty. They may find themselves pulling back from conversations, growing quieter, becoming more reflective in moments that once held no emotional weight for them. The deeper the connection was, the more forcefully the unconscious begins revealing what conscious pride tried to suppress. And gradually, silence stops being a wall they hide behind. It becomes the very thing that exposes everything they were hiding. The unconscious mind is a far more powerful force than most people choose to acknowledge. A person can convince themselves with great confidence that they have moved forward, that the emotions are resolved, that time has handled what they refuse to handle directly. They can perform this certainty well enough to fool others and even, temporarily, themselves. But beneath the performance, the psyche continues its own work. It does not ask for permission. It does not respond to denial. It simply continues carrying everything that once held genuine emotional significance, and it carries it with depth and persistence that the conscious mind cannot override indefinitely. This is a fundamental difference between ordinary memory and unconscious emotional memory. Ordinary memory stores facts and events. Unconscious emotional memory stores living psychological energy. When something or someone affected a person at a real level, at the level where identity and emotion and vulnerability all intersect, that experience does not become a simple archive record. It becomes an active presence within the deeper personality. It continues influencing how the person feels, how they respond, what they avoid, what they unconsciously seek, and what they find themselves returning to when the distractions fade. Many people believe that forgetting is a choice they can make. They believe that if they stay busy enough, distract themselves efficiently enough, and avoid emotional reflection long enough, the past will gradually lose its hold. But this belief misunderstands how the unconscious operates. What was emotionally significant does not become insignificant simply because the ego decides it should. The more meaningful connection, the more deeply embedded its emotional imprint becomes within the psychological structure of the person. And that imprint continues shaping experience from the inside, even when the outside gives no indication that anything remains. This is why people are often caught off guard by their own emotions. A familiar sound, a particular quality of light, an unexpected moment of stillness, and suddenly something rises within them that they believe is finished. The conscious mind is genuinely surprised because it had declared the situation over, but the unconscious never agreed. It was simply waiting for a moment when the defenses were lowered and the emotional truth could finally surface again. This process is not weakness. It is a natural functioning of a psyche that is trying to achieve wholeness, try to resolve what was left incomplete, trying to bring into awareness what was never fully acknowledged. When someone caused damage to a meaningful connection, the unconscious stores not only the memory of that person, but the emotional truth of what that loss represented. The conscious ego constructs defenses quickly. It finds reasons, creates justifications, assigns blame to circumstances or timing or outside forces. It builds an internal story that protects self-image from the discomfort of responsibility. But beneath all of that construction, something else is happening. The deeper self already understands what occurred. It already knows the difference between what was said and what was true. And this creates an internal conflict that does not resolve easily, a split between the version of themselves the person wants to believe in and the version their actions revealed. Over time, this conflict begins affecting the person in ways that accumulate. At first, pride holds the structure together. The ego is strong and the distractions are plentiful. But as silence and absence create more space, the unconscious grows louder. The mind begins returning to certain memories with a frequency that feels involuntary. Specific moments take on new emotional weight. Details that once seemed insignificant now carry the quiet but unmistakable feeling of something important that was missed or wasted. The unconscious is not torturing the person arbitrarily. It is revealing the hidden emotional value of the connection they damaged, showing them, from the inside, what they refused to see when they had the chance. Dreams become a significant part of this process. The unconscious communicates with particular honesty during sleep because the ego's defenses are reduced. A person may find themselves dreaming about someone they insist they no longer think about. They may wake from those dreams with emotions that feel strangely present and real, more present than the waking feelings they perform for others. This is the unconscious delivering a message it cannot send through normal channels because the conscious mind keeps rejecting it. Dreams bypass pride. They bypass the carefully constructed story, and they reveal in their own symbolic language what still lives within the psyche regardless of what the waking mind claims. Human beings have a deep and largely unexamined tendency to normalize what is consistently present. The mind adapts to availability. What is always there eventually stops being consciously registered as something valuable, not because its value is diminished, but because familiarity reduces the psychological urgency to notice it. Presence becomes background. Attention becomes assumption. Emotional support becomes something taken for granted not out of cruelty, but out of the simple psychological mechanics of how human awareness functions when something is never at risk of disappearing. This is one of the most painful truths about human nature. The very consistency that makes a genuine connection feel safe is also the quality that makes it psychologically invisible over time. And so people stop fully seeing it. They stop appreciating the depth of what is being offered. They move through the connection passively, receiving without fully recognizing what they are receiving, until the day that consistency is no longer there. And on that day, the absence arrives with force that the constant presence never created. Loss interrupts illusion in a way that nothing else can. When someone who genuinely mattered becomes emotionally unavailable, the routines built around their presence begin revealing how much meaning they contained. Conversations that once seemed simple become memories loaded with emotional weight. Places and situations that were shared now carry a quality of absence that is almost tangible. The ordinary moments that were never given proper attention become, in hindsight, the most significant ones. And the mind begins a slow and often painful process of understanding what it failed to understand in real time. The ego resists this process at first. It does not want to admit that it failed to appreciate something irreplaceable. It does not want to face the discomfort of recognizing its own emotional blindness. So it minimizes. It tells the person they are fine. It suggests that what was lost can be replaced. It creates a temporary buffer between the individual and the full weight of the emotional truth they are moving toward. But the unconscious is patient. And as absence continues and the buffer gradually erodes, the truth that was always there begins rising into conscious awareness with a quiet but undeniable force. There is a particular psychological reason why absence creates such powerful awareness. Human beings understand emotional value most clearly through contrast. Warmth is understood deeply only by someone who has experienced genuine coldness. Connection is understood fully only by someone who has lived inside real loneliness. In the same way, the emotional importance of a specific person becomes unmistakably clear only when life must be lived without them. The contrast created by loss does what consistent presence could never accomplish. It makes the value visible by removing it entirely. This is why some people undergo fundamental changes after losing a meaningful connection. Someone who acted carelessly begins moving through life with more reflection. Someone who avoided emotional depth begins seeking it. The pain of genuine loss has a unique capacity to awaken self-awareness because it cannot be argued with, managed, or intellectually dismissed. It is felt directly. And what is felt directly has the power to change not just behavior, but the deeper structure of how a person understands themselves and others, The realization that begins emerging is not comfortable. It requires the person to look honestly at their own emotional patterns, at the fear that made them distant, the pride that made them careless, the avoidance that prevented them from being present when presence was needed. These recognitions do not arrive all at once. They surface gradually, like something rising through still water. But each recognition adds to the accumulating weight of understanding. And as understanding grows, the personal loss is shaped and becomes increasingly different from the person who caused it. The painful truth, however, is that awareness very often arrives at the precise moment it can no longer change the outcome. By the time someone fully comprehends the value of what they lost, the damage may already be beyond what repair can reach. Yet, even then, the transformation continues. The loss becomes a psychological mirror, one that reflects back not only what was wasted externally, but what was undeveloped internally, what was emotionally immature, what was defended when it should have been opened, what was silent when it should have spoken. And this confrontation with the deeper self, however late it arrives, continues reshaping the personality from within. Because the human soul learns certain things only through the specific quality of pain that comes from losing what was real. When a person begins genuinely understanding the mistake they made, the change does not start in what they say. It starts in what they feel when no one is watching. It starts in the quiet internal tension between the identity they constructed and the truth that identity can no longer fully contain. This is the psychological beginning of inner transformation, not the dramatic moment of confession, but the private moment of recognition that happens first. Deep within the emotional structure of who they are, the ego and the deeper self enter into conflict at this point. The ego continues insisting on its defenses, on pride, on justification, on the protection of self-image. But the deeper self, carrying the full emotional weight of what occurred, begins pushing the opposite direction. It wants resolution. It wants honesty. It wants the kind of wholeness that cannot be achieved while the inner world remains divided against itself. And this conflict creates a kind of psychological restlessness that does not ease with ordinary distraction. The person becomes emotionally inconsistent in ways they may not fully understand. They move toward and away from the situation without clear intention. They appear composed in certain moments and strangely unsettled in others. They may become more sensitive to topics they would have dismissed before. They may find themselves softer in situations that once triggered their defenses. These shifts are not accidental. They are the external evidence of an internal process that is rewriting something fundamental within the personality, slowly, quietly, and without asking for the ego's permission. Maintaining denial over time is genuinely exhausting. It requires ongoing effort. The person must repeatedly choose their constructed story over the emotional truth that keeps attempting to surface. They must continuously redirect attention away from the memories and realizations the unconscious keeps presenting. Over time, this effort wears down the psychological infrastructure that was holding the denial in place. The energy required to keep the truth buried begins exceeding the energy available to sustain it. And at some point, what was suppressed can no longer stay suppressed. The emotional reality breaks through, not violently, but inevitably. When that breakthrough comes, something in the identity begins fracturing in a way that ultimately serves growth. The image the person held of themselves, as someone in control, as someone emotionally detached, as someone who made the right choice, begins revealing its incompleteness. They are confronted not with an external accusation, but with an internal one. They see the gap between who they believe they were and who their actions revealed them to be. And this gap, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. The discomfort created by this self-confrontation is precisely what drives genuine transformation. Psychological growth does not occur in comfort. It occurs in the friction between illusion and reality, between who we were and who we are being forced to become through the consequences of our choices. A person who reaches this level of honest self-awareness often begins changing in ways that extend far beyond the specific situation that initiated the process. Their relationship with vulnerability changes. Their capacity for emotional honesty deepens. Their understanding of what genuine connection requires becomes more real and less theoretical. They may develop empathy in a form they never possessed before, not as a concept, but as a felt understanding of what it means to cause pain to someone who offered something real. They begin making different choices, not because they've been told to, but because their inner world has been permanently altered by the awareness of what their previous choices cost. Emotional depth that was once avoided becomes something they seek because they now understand from the inside what its absence creates. Real transformation does not begin in the moment of suffering. It begins in the moment of understanding. Pain alone does not change a person. Pain that is understood, pain that is traced back to its source, connected to specific choices and patterns and the deeper fears those patterns are protecting, that is the kind of pain that reshapes the personality permanently. Most people move through suffering without being transformed by it because they never truly examine it. They endure it. They wait for it to pass. They distract themselves from it. They allow it to fade without ever asking what it was trying to teach them. And because they never ask, the unconscious pattern that created the situation remains intact. The same emotional defenses, the same avoidance of vulnerability, the same inability to recognize genuine value in the presence of something real, all of it remains in place, ready to create the same kind of loss again in a different situation with a different person. But the person who pauses inside the suffering, who turns toward it instead of away from it, who asks themselves honestly what their actions revealed about the fears and immaturity that were driving them, that person encounters the possibility of something different, not just temporary change, but structural change, a change in the way they relate to others, to emotional depth, to their own vulnerability, and to the recognition of value before loss is required to teach it. This is the full weight of what realization carries. Not just the pain of what was lost externally, but the transformation of who a person becomes internally as a result of truly facing that loss. The connection may be gone. The damage may be irreparable. But the psychological impact of genuinely understanding what was destroyed and why, and what within themselves made that destruction possible, that impact continues working within the personality for the rest of their life, shaping them, deepening them, slowly and permanently changing what they are capable of offering to the people who come next. Because the human soul is capable of learning. It is capable of growth. But it learns most profoundly through absence. It grows most permanently through the specific pain of understanding too late what it failed to protect when it had the chance that, in the end, no one escapes the emotional truth of what they have done to something real. A person may hide for a long time behind silence, behind distance, behind pride or distraction or the careful performance of not caring. But the unconscious continues its work regardless. It carries the weight. It keeps the record. It returns again and again to what was left unresolved, to what was lost carelessly, to what deserved more than it received. And when the realization finally arrives, not as an idea but as a felt truth, landing the body and the deeper mind of the full force of what it means, the person carrying it is never entirely the same again. They have been changed by the awareness of their own emotional blindness. They have been shaped by the understanding of what genuine connection actually costs to lose. And they carry that understanding forward into every relationship that follows, into every moment that asks them to choose between pride and presence, between avoidance and honesty, between taking something real for granted and truly seeing it while it is still there. This is the weight of realization. This is the quiet, irreversible power of emotional awakening. And this is why, in the end, awareness does not simply change what a person thinks. It changes who they are. Thank you for being here, for listening with an open heart, and for allowing these words to meet you wherever you are in your own journey. May you carry this awareness gently, and may it guide you toward the kind of presence, honesty, and emotional depth that makes genuine connection possible before silence and loss are ever forced to teach its value. Good luck on your journey, and may you always choose awareness before absence has to create for you.